Hello, 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 hello. Hello, 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 my testing. Hello.
Union Home Minister Amit Shah announced that two Union Home Minister Union Home Minister Amit Shah
Hello. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mayuri. I am a senior resident fellow at Vidhi Centre for Legal Policy, where I work with Vidhi's dedicated constitutional law team, Charkha. I'm here with my colleague Anshul, who is a research fellow at Charkha. Anshul will be co-moderating this session alongside me. We are delighted to welcome you all to this panel discussion on an intricate issue of contemporary constitutional law and constitutional politics, which is delimitation of electoral constituencies in India. We began our research on delimitation last year, hoping to fill the void of scant literature on the issue before the upcoming delimitation. We released our first report in the series last month. We would like to use this opportunity to show a short video on our report, The States in Parliament, authored by our colleagues Ritwika Sharma and Lalit Panda.
Union Home Minister Amit Shah announced that two key tasks would be undertaken after the 2024 Lok Sabha polls: the national census and delimitation of India's electoral constituencies. But what exactly does delimitation mean? Delimitation is the process of drawing the boundaries of electoral constituencies, the very lines that define who gets to vote where. The outcome of delimitation also determines how many seats each state gets in the Parliament of India. The Constitution of India expects each voter's vote to have equal value, irrespective of which part of the country they are in. This is where delimitation comes in. The Constitution mandates that each state's representation in Parliament should be proportional to its population. Simultaneously, all electoral constituencies are expected to be of roughly equal size. When constituencies have vastly different populations, the value and power of your vote depends on where you live. Smaller constituency would naturally mean that your vote counts for more. Here's the catch. The allocation of Lok Sabha seats was frozen in 1976 by the 42nd Amendment to the Constitution of India. Despite massive demographic changes across the country, states in North India have witnessed faster population growth, creating a serious imbalance in representation. Currently, one MP in Uttar Pradesh represents far more citizens than an MP in Kerala or Tamil Nadu. To fix this imbalance, delimitation could be carried out based on current population levels, in pursuance of the one person, one vote, one value principle. That would, however, drastically alter the number of seats each state has in parliament. While certain states will definitely gain seats, others could lose out on some. The Constitution expects the freeze on allocation of seats in parliament to be lifted in 2026. It is critical to talk about delimitation now more than ever. Read Vidhi's report on delimitation, political equality, and federalism in India to know how can we ensure a constitutionally acceptable delimitation and reallocation of seats in parliament in 2026.
Hi, everyone. So I hope that that video was able to give you some context as to what we are being speaking today, and particularly to all the moot court participants who have worked tirelessly on this sort of problem. Let me take a moment to kind of introduce our panelists. While I'm sure that all of you are well aware of Dr. Chandra and Professor Aditi, and I'll try to do justice to the accomplishments that they have done. So Dr. Chandramouli is a retired IAS officer with 4 decades of experience of working with the governments at different level, both the national, the international, and the local levels as well. Dr. Chandramouli also served as the Registrar General and the Census Commissioner of India for the 2011 census and oversaw one of the largest and most complex data collection exercises in the world, the decennial census of India. His tenure has been marked by the introduction of innovative methods for data collection, including digital tools and techniques aimed at improving accuracy, transparency, and efficiency in capturing the demographic, economic, and social data of India's vast and diverse population. His work has been crucial in ensuring that census data informs evidence-based policy making and development initiatives across sectors such as healthcare, education, urban planning, and resource allocation. Known for his dedication to public service, Dr. Chandramouli has earned widespread respect both within the government circles and in the broader field of public administration. So thank you so much, Dr. Chandramouli, for giving some time out of your precious schedule. On the other hand, we have Professor Aditi, who is an associate professor at Jindal Global Law School, a fellow alumna. She completed her BLLB honors from the National University of Juridical Sciences in Kolkata. Thereafter, she pursued her postgraduate studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, where she worked extensively on South Asian public laws and politics. She's currently pursuing a PhD from Jindal Global University, where her research links representation with alternative conceptualizations of the welfare state. Her interest area includes constitutional law, election law, family law, and grassroots governance, with sort of extensive expertise in legal theory, constitutional law, and human rights. Professor Aditi is very well known for her interdisciplinary approach, blending law with insights from political science, sociology, and history. She's been known to be one of the foremost writers in sort of delimitation. In addition to her academic endeavors, she has also been a vocal supporter of initiatives aimed at promoting legal literacy and empowerment at the grassroots level. So thank you so much, Professor Aditi, for being here. thank you to both the panelists for being here. We are extremely grateful to have you. And I think it's good to have someone from the policy and the academic sector to kind of contribute to the panel discussion. Over to you, Mayuri.
So we would like to start. I've seen census very close. And we like to have your insights on the process of census. It would be great if we can learn from you on how the how Please.
So good evening. I'm not a lawyer, but I do practice law because I've dealt with quite a lot of quasi-judicial functions. And I do now deal with the law as far as arbitrations and conciliations go. So today, the topic chosen is delimitation and census. But before we go into that, I couldn't help but, listening to the inaugural speeches. You're a generation which is a Google Plus generation. Justice said that you could step out of the court on a recess and then Google up some latest references. But today, you can have whole arguments generated by ChatGPT. By the way, how many of you use ChatGPT? Very few. But you'll find that many of you will start using it soon. And it can really give you an entire flow of argument. But then standing up and presenting those arguments before their lordships and convincing them is something which you learn through the actual practice of presenting these facts. You can get the facts from them, but how do you present them is, I think, what you will learn in these moot courts. And I congratulate all of you for making it this far, and all the best in the days to come. My fellow panelists, thank you for inviting me, and thanks to Vidhi and NALSAR for having me here. So we are going to talk about the census and delimitation. Are we on a slideshow mode? Slideshow. You can do it from there. Yeah, I would like you to reflect on this map. What do you see here? This is a map of India which shows the population and compares it with different countries of the world. And if you see how many countries are represented, that is the population of 1.4 billion, which, a state like UP, hardly 5 countries in the world have more population than UP. 5 countries in the world. And each of them, if you take, has a parliament, has a senate, whatever, Congress, whatever you call it. And we have just 1 Rajya Sabha and 1 Lok Sabha. So just reflect on the size, the sheer magnitude of India and what it means. You saw the video in which it talked about population and representation. So let's set the context. Now, what is the context? The context here is political representation in India is an essential element of governance, and it ensures citizens from diverse regions and communities have their voices heard in the decision-making process that shape the nation. In the initial inaugural session, you heard about diversity being a factor. Now, inclusion is also a factor. When you have reservation, you need data to show which constituencies have to be reserved for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, which constitutions, now that the women's reservation bill has been announced, how do you delimit constituencies to represent only women? So these are all issues which you will have to ponder about. Now, if you see how it has been handled in the past, one, on the basis of population shifts, two, on constitutional amendments, and three, on political necessities. When I say political necessities, new states have been formed. Since independence, new states have been formed. So it required readjustment of the boundaries. So if you see this, in 52, there were only 489 members. 57, when the states were reorganized along linguistic lines, it went up to 500. In 73, there were 545 members, of which 543 were elected and 2 were nominated from the Anglo-Indian community. Then you had the 31st Amendment, which froze the allocation of seats based on the 1971 census. Then you had the 104th Constitutional Amendment in 2020, which removed the provision for nominated members of the Anglo-Indian community. So these are the changes which have been taking place over time. As far as the Rajya Sabha is concerned, you had 250 members in 1950. Now you have about 245, of which 233 are elected and 12 are nominated. The balancing of power between the Lok Sabha population-based and the Rajya Sabha, which is state-based, has been one of India's core methods so far of ensuring democratic fairness. We talked about large states getting more representation and smaller states who have managed their population getting lesser number of seats, and this affecting the balance of power. This is what has been the debate which has been going on. So the key question is political representation or population control. This is the key question you'll have to answer. So one of the key challenges, therefore, in Indian democracy is ensuring fair political representation while encouraging states to implement population control policies. If India continues to base its political representation solely on population size, states that have successfully controlled their population will lose influence over time, while states with rapid population growth will gain more power. This may create disincentives for population control and may foster regional inequalities. Now, this is the question. Where do we lean towards? Do we lean towards a fairer political representation which truly reflects the population? Because after all, a member of parliament represents a constituency, which means he represents constituents. So is it fair that in one constituency, about 5 lakh constituents are there, whereas in a smaller state, hardly 50,000 people represent a constituency? So these are the questions which you are going to debate in the coming days. Now, about delimitation, you have already been told that they have two functions. One is determining seats, the other is determining boundaries. So this is what delimitation is all about. So we did a delimitation last in 2002. But since the constitutional freeze was there, we could only redraw the boundaries, but not alter the number of seats in the parliament. So we did do delimitation, but now we have to confront this problem that after 2026, the census was to be conducted in 2021, but since it has not been conducted due to COVID, now the first census after 2021, after that, there would be a delimitation, not later than 2026. If by then we don't have a census, then probably this date of 2026 has to be further postponed. Now let's go into why the census and why it is based on a census. First of all, let me give you a background. The history is that we have an unbroken series of censuses since 1872. 1872 was the first census, 1881 was the imperial census, which was an all India census. And since then, every 10 years, like clockwork, whether there were wars, World War, or there was the national struggle, we have conducted the census. Gandhiji, in fact, went as far as saying that, everything else don't cooperate, but the census must go on. So that was the importance given to the decadal exercise, and it had almost become an institution. So what it meant was there was a continuity in processes and there was a consistency in the questions. We were talking before this that there has to be some kind of a comparability over time. Only then data makes sense. So this provided that within every decade, what were the changes that took place in the country? How did the gender composition change? How did the actual settlement of population change? Whether more people migrated from the rural areas to the urban areas. Within urban areas, what is the kind of population pressures which are happening in which particular areas of these are all crucial questions which guide decision making today. So what started initially in the British period as an idle curiosity of an eccentric Sarkar. The Sarkar, the British Sarkar, the Raj wanted to collect some information about the people they were governing. They had a colonial mindset which said, unless we understand the people of whom we govern, we cannot govern properly. So they went about collecting detailed information on race, on caste, on languages. And many of them were anthropologists, many of them were linguists. So depending on their inclinations of the census commissioner. But since independence, our whole concept is that this should become the foundation of informed decision making. Decisions have to be taken based on data and not randomly on the whims and fancies of the policymakers. So it has moved in these 140 years from just an idle curiosity to actually a journey where data forms the basis of decision making. Now, what are the objectives of any census? One, it is 100% coverage of the country. That's very important for delimitation too. Every part of the country has to be covered without leaving out any omissions. Two, the quality of the data which you collect has to be accurate, reasonably accurate. Three, it has to be collected within a reasonable cost. And finally, it has to be brought out within a reasonable time. So these are the four objectives of conducting a census. But what are the challenges? I said coverage. We have to get no cost or time overruns, and we have to ensure maximum efficiency. And all this the first time. I cannot afford to go back to the population and count 1.4 billion because I made a mistake somewhere or I left out a particular area. It has to be right the first time. And many of you probably know, we do the census from the 9th of February to the 28th of February, just these 3 weeks. The entire country is covered. And why we do it in a short period of time is to prevent migration. I might have been in my village, then I go over to the town, and if I give a long period gap, then I'll be counted twice. So to avoid that duplication, we restrict the time and ensure that the population which we get is on a reference point, on a reference date and a reference time. So we have to finally get it right the first time. Now, to get it right the first time, look at what our challenges are. At that time, in the 2011 census, it was covering a population of 1.2 billion, which is the second largest in the world. Now we are the first largest. Covers 2.4% of the world surface area, 6.6 million villages, about 8,000 towns, more than 4,600 ethnic groups, 80,000 segments, synonyms, titles, multicultural, 655 religions and persuasions, 18 languages which we use for training our enumerators. 16 languages are actually canvassing the forms, and 6,661 mother tongues. Why these are important? I can't go and ask a person in Telangana a question in Tamil. So I need to have people who know the local language. And each area within a state speaks different languages. There are difficult people to access. Nomads who have no permanent place, the houseless, forest and island dwellers. To give you an example, there is a Sentinelese island in Andaman and Nicobar. No one has landed in that island to count them. What we do is we go in a boat, throw some coconut and red color cloth into the sea. They come to collect it. We quickly grab a video of that, go back and then count. And last census, we had hardly 32 to 35 people actually being counted over there, but there were small children along that, so we knew that that tribe was also increasing. And while we were taking the video, they started throwing spears and arrows at us, and we had to retreat. There's a very, very nice video where our whole boat starts rocking when we are trying to do this exercise. And there are areas which are difficult to access because of Naxalism, extremism, etc. So that becomes an issue where we go with armed escorts to do a civil exercise. But why have I put infants, elderly women, and disabled as difficult people? Now, these are the people whom the families do not reveal, either due to the fact that they think they are unproductive people and therefore why reveal them in a national census, or because of stigma. If disabled, then they say that, okay, there's a stigma around saying that I have a disabled person in my house. So these are difficult people to access, and we have to take special the population of these people. Disturbed civil conditions, inaccessible terrain, etc. We already have spoken about. Now, to take you through a quick snapshot of how the census is done, about 3 million people are engaged to go house to house, collect the information. Last time it was done on paper. The paper forms come back to centers where it is scanned. This is the first time we use intelligent character recognition, where we did not do a manual. Earlier, we used to count and then, write. But here, the scans used to take place. The images used to be recognized by a software. And that image finally converted into data, and data became tabulations, and we disseminated the data. So this was a fairly highly technical exercise, which very few countries have been able to manage on the scale that we operate. So we start with administrative steps. I won't take long on this. Basically, we freeze all boundaries 1 year before the census. And why we do this? Because we'll have to allocate people along various geographies, starting from a 600 population, one enumerator. Above that is a supervisory circle, then a tehsil, then a block, then a district, district to state, state to the country. So we really have to have an accurate list of towns, of villages, and then allocate the business of collecting the information. So we use very low-tech technology over here, where basically every 600 population, we have a register like this, where a person has gone around and said, okay, in house number 1, this is the house, it's a pakka house, kacha house. In that 4 families live, and the head of each of these 4 families is XYZ. So this is the starting point. Then we draw maps. While we have, hand-drawn maps where the local enumerator goes and actually draws a map like this. So there were about 2.4 million such hand-drawn maps available. And believe me, it might look very crude, but during a disaster in Uttarakhand, a whole village was wiped out. There were no maps of that area way in the mountains. It was these maps which showed, okay, Ram Singh's house was here, Kishan lived there, these were the public assets over there, and we could recreate that village from a rubble. So this is the kind of effective mapping. We also have sophisticated mapping where we use satellite technology, drone technology, and all to bring out very sophisticated digital maps. Then, of course, publicity, we used all the mediums that are available. And if you're wondering who that lady next to Priyanka Chopra or Sachin Tendulkar was, that was our mascot. People gave her various names, but we called her the census face. We took special campaigns to contact the vulnerable groups. And this was very effective because the PWD Act and the National Trust Act, these are 2 acts which are now statutes which have to be honored by all states. And unless we have good data on the various types of disabilities and then, the various benefits that flow to these people with disabilities, I think census plays a very, very fundamental role in this. On the technology again, we used for the first time, we had no specifications even of the paper to be used because this has to be very high tensile paper. It also has to be scannable. It has to be, a lot of technical specs had to go into it. So this was used for the first time. Logistics was a major issue. As I said, each area had a different requirement. Telangana, for example, in some areas it would be canvassed in Telugu, some areas it would be in Urdu, some areas it would be in Hindi. And they would tell us that we want 4,000 forms of this, 5,000 forms of that, 6,000. It had to be printed, packed, dispatched to them at that precise location. And on the use of technology, we used whatever was the latest in that census. We started with unit record machines, went on to key punch machines, then went on to a key to disk machine, then mainframe. From 2001, we've been using the technology of image recognition. And this, I may share, is quite a sophisticated process, which very few countries in the world have expertise in. Now on the cost, we do it at a minimum cost of 18 rupees per person. And this, believe me, is the lowest cost-effective census in the world. Compare it with Western countries, they spend almost $18 to $20 per person. And still they don't get the accuracy and the coverage that we get with such a low investment of just 18 rupees or $0.4 per person. Now the question is delimitation. This gives you the graph on the left-hand side, how the population has grown. Okay, and see from 1980s, the population is on the downswing. And it's expected to go down further. Question is, will you continue to keep changing your representation every time a population falls? Every time it rises? Okay, when it was on a steady rising path, you had some kind. Will you keep fiddling with the representations every 10 years? This is a question which we will have to really address. What does it mean to keep on changing boundaries? Every 10 years, can you afford to really do redistricting or what you call delimitation? And on the right-hand side, you have the population projections for the country. And if you see here, the population is going to rise. But the rise is not going to be equal across the states. Many of you have heard that we have already reached a stable population level in most states. Your fertility has reached a kind of a saturation point where it is below 2.1, which is the replacement level fertility in the country, in the world. So which means now we have reached a stable state. The question arises, can we also have a stable parliament? This is a question. I mean, there are pros, there are cons, but it is up to you to really think about it, that when the fertility in the country is reaching a stable state, population is going to reach a stable state, then do we really need to keep fiddling around with the representation? Okay, we have only talked about one side which says that, okay, population is rising everywhere and so it should reflect, which gives vociferous protests, saying that why should I suffer because I controlled my population through policy. I deliberately controlled my population and now you're penalizing me for it. So UP can go and get 9 or 10 seats extra and I will have to give up my seats because I foolishly went and controlled my population. Now the fairness of this, the equity of this has to be a point which has to be central in your discussion. So the future of delimitation basically is based today on population. So if it continues to be based on population, states which have large populations will get to gain. The video showed that. And states which have controlled their population might lose. And many states might not have any change. So this is going to be what is in the future. One option is let the status quo continue. So what is the most evident thing against the status quo? You've already seen in the video that there will be a mismatch between the population and the representation. So unequal representation, it was very graphically shown. Democratic imbalance, it ignores the realities on ground. And the last argument is basically the burden. The poorer states have performed worse off in the population control. So poverty and demography have a close connection. So can you really penalize the states because of other reasons? Because they are poor states, they have gone into a vicious cycle of larger populations. So this is also an argument which is trotted out, saying that, okay, the burden of large populations is also contributing to poverty, and therefore they also say that it limits political dynamism by locking in historical population trends, which are no longer relevant, which we already talked about. Creates an inevitable buildup of pressure. The other thing is that, look, by postponing since 71, you haven't done it. And suddenly you find if you had just increased one seat here, one seat there, or reduced one seat here and there, people wouldn't have really affected the people much. You won't be meddling too much. But suddenly, after so many years, some calculations have shown that you need 500 more constituencies to be created if you want to really represent it on a population basis. You will have to create 500 more seats in addition to the 543 you already have. Now, can you really afford it? That is a question which we may have to grapple with. So, but status quo is definitely not an option. We have to think about alternate strategies. And we'll have to adopt and adapt some of the other countries, what they have done to solve this problem. We may have to, our whole constitution itself is an adopted and adapted constitution. So why not for delimitation too? So just a quick, Professor will give us more on this. One of the options is to do a weighted representation. They said, one, can we change the weight of the vote? Can we have a weighted representation? This is one option. It goes against that concept of one person, one vote and all that. But without increasing the number of seats, can we say, okay, the states of the South will have this much weight, the states of the North will have so much weight. So something to discuss. What USA has done, worthwhile looking at USA, Canada, where the House of Representatives is as per population, but the Senate is based on an equal representation. Canada, which also goes through a redistribution every 10 years, but they try to balance states which have very low population like St. Edward Island or something with a more populous state like Ontario or so we can learn from their experience. Australia has population base for the House of Representatives and for the Senate, equal representation of all the states. Germany has a weighted voting system. Switzerland has equal representation. So there are many models. The European Union talks of a digressive proportionality, which probably in the report also they have talked about quite extensively. So we have a lot to learn. Another option is probably capping the seat redistribution and doing a very gradual, not really reflecting a sudden change by saying that, okay, UP will today get 50 more seats, but do it gradually so that, you know, step by step. Other things as, why do you want to talk only of political representation? Can you not base it on socio-economic performance? This is some ideas which have come up. Gradual reallocation of seats is another thing. Or just adjust representations within the state, but don't do anything with the parliament. This is another option that you can think of. But finally, what will work? What will work is a balancing of the political representation in India's diverse and growing democracy. And we will have to find a combination of strategies which will lead to this balanced solution. I hope we have put the perspective of the entire debate that you're going to have from various angles. I wish you all the best and thank you once again for this wonderful opportunity of meeting.
Thank you, sir, for this wonderful presentation and enlightening us on the process of conducting the census. Professor Aditi, we'll move on to you now. Process of conducting delimitation.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to NALSAR and Vidhi for having me here. Well, on the issue of delimitation, I think the one thing from the state's perspective that we need to understand is often the debate comes down to two specific categorizations of representation being pitted against each other. Often the question is framed on the terms of voting equality versus political equality, right? The idea that either you could have one person, one vote, where the person is being represented on an individual capacity and have a parity on that particular criteria. On the other hand, the basic unit of representation changes into the question of political equality. And often in case of delimitation, the most often used metric for political equality, for creating an argument of political equality, is state identity, right? Federal balance. That on one hand, where you're in terms of voting equality, you are arguing for an individual person to be fairly represented, to be equally represented. On the other hand, in case of federal balance, you argue for a state identity and their specific concerns to be equally represented, which is a valid argument. But we need to here understand a couple of things to contextualize this debate. First of all, the constitutional understanding of how each of these basic metrics of representation is institutionalized is something that we'll have to start our discussion with. Like Professor Chandra had discussed initially in his presentation as well, the Constitution institutionalizes individual representation in Lok Sabha and institutionalizes state representation in Rajya Sabha, right? So while delimitation focuses on the idea of individual being fairly represented, equally represented, where all votes would have an equivalent say in the decision-making process of the Lok Sabha, the state representation, federal representation finds its place in Rajya Sabha per se. So the current argument that the state often likes to give to remain in the status quo of the delimitation freeze is that if we remove the freeze or if we engage with delimitation any further, this federal balance in itself is going to be disrupted because a lot of the states which stand to gain from the new exercise would be in the north, and a lot of the states which stand to lose seats because of this exercise would be in the south, in the east, in the northeast even. But the question here is that, first of all, identity is a complex matrix, right? Political equality is a very broad question for us to consider, in which is but only one variable, right? And again, even within the state, concerns that a particular state may have in the national decision making always homogeneous so as to be represented by their representatives. Having said that, we need to consider the understanding of states' rights, the issue of state rights and federal balance as well, especially in the current atmosphere where we do see increasing threats and increasing in increasing ways in which the central government is sort of limiting the rights of the state to take decisions for themselves, governing their own matters. However, we need to understand that voting equality and political equality do not present a binary choice for us, right? It's not a binary conflict where you could either vote for one or vote for the other. It although presents before us a broader discussion where we basically need to scrutinize institutions on a multiple level, on different layered understanding to understand where can our specific problems find solutions, right? Where the problem in itself focuses on sites for the states to exercise power, we could look at not only the different formulations for delimitation, but we could also look at the formulation of Rajya Sabha and the kind of opportunity it grants to different states to control their affairs or to have a specific say in the elements of decision-making process. One example can be the money bills that are passed in the parliament, where the Rajya Sabha does not have as much agency to control the decision-making process as the Lok Sabha does. So in money matters specifically, right now there's a raging debate going on how to define money bills in the first place. But once you reach that conclusion, it would basically mean that in the current atmosphere, even if you go ahead with delimitation or stop it, the agency that the states would have in affecting the passing of money bills would still be limited, right? So in this instance, then, institutionalization matters. You could go for equal voting parity in Lok Sabha and then find reforms in how the state powers are better expressed in institutions like the Rajya Sabha. You could also, as Professor Chandra also pointed out, look at the idea of electoral systems and how different identities, different intersectionalities can find expression in the way we choose to represent ourselves. One of the important elements of the delimitation narrative has been that all of the actions in terms of imposition of freeze and its extension have been governed mostly by political interests of the governing parties, because a lot of, how these equations are drawn, how these lines are drawn, would also in sometimes determine who the ultimate winner of an election is going to be. So depending upon who the winners and the losers may be of this exercise, the position of the government also keeps on changing, keeps on evolving, depending upon what they have to gain out of this particular solution. But one thing that this dialogue requires is a holistic understanding of different variables in terms of representation. Representation in itself presents before us a lot of different variables. India, being a very diverse and plural country, again, was really well represented by the presentation given by Dr. Chandra, needs some important choices that have to be made in understanding how these decisions have to be taken, how you want the representation to be translated, to be manifested in these institutions, and what kind of intersectionalities, what kind of diversities do you want to give expression to? And delimitation in itself, although being a very important exercise in understanding these different variables which are at play, should not be the only site that we look for solutions in, right? The current status quo basically finds itself in an impasse because of this particular understanding, because we basically create a binary question of voting equality versus federal imbalance, and then pit one against the other, claiming that this cannot happen because it would disrupt the other element of this particular binary. But that in itself is at best avoiding a question which really needs engagement after 5 decades of inaction in this particular aspect. Because inaction in this instance, again, is only going to increase the gaps, is only going to increase the disruptions. And even at this point of time, because we are avoiding engagement with this problem in the first place, it's not that, yes, we don't have voting equality at this point of time, but currently we don't even have federal equality at that point. The current status also is not uniquely suited to the balancing of federal powers or state institutions as they currently stand. So avoiding the question, as the state seems to have done for the past 40 years at least, would only increase the problems, only increase the gaps that have existed in this particular issue, and would only make the problem seem more stark as and when we get to it to make final decisions on this particular matter. So yes, as today's discussion might have pointed it out for you, there are no easy answers as far as this question is concerned. It touches upon a lot of different variables. It requires a lot of tough questions to be answered and some tough choices to be made by the decision makers and the stakeholders in this instance. But we do need to consider institutional choices, systemic changes that can actually tackle both aspects of voting equality on one hand and political equality, agency in decision-making process with respect to diverse identities on the other, right? Because we want the plurality and diversity of the country to be reflected in the decision-making processes of the country, should not be an excuse for the state to even let go of the basic fundamental understanding of voting equality, which has been recognized in countries like the US. They've been recognized voting equality as part of their equal protection clause, which would mean that because a person is equally protected from the laws, it's his right to be equally represented as well. That's another shortcoming that our narrative faces in this instance is the refusal of the judiciary to actually enter this particular debate and engage with this particular discussion, or at least initiate some action as far as the legislature is concerned, because the courts so far have refused to identify voting equality as one of the rights that can be justiciable before them. They've also identified this as a political question and have refused again to engage with this particular question on a legal understanding of whether this can be a justiciable or a right that can be protected by that particular institution. So the debate in this particular instance, the one thing that I would like you to take away from this discussion is that this is not a binary question. This is not a question of either or. It's not the question of voting equality on one hand or political equality on the other. The question is, how do you strike a balance, right? The question is, what kind of representation, diversity, plurality would you like in your decision-making institutions? How can you give not just representation to different elements of the social hierarchies in the country, but can also give them agency, power to affect the decisions that are being taken at a national level and to represent their own narratives, their everydayness in the central stage. And let's hope that this particular exercise, this discussion that we're having in the institutions like this would finally initiate a conversation, a productive dialogue as far as this question is concerned. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Aditi, for that. I think it very well fits into sort of the entire discussion that we wanted to have, particularly around delimitation and census. Dr. Chandramoulli's kind of presentation gave us practical insights as to how the census happened, whereas Professor Aditi kindly explained the constitutional principles surrounding sort of voting equality and sort of political equality. I would want to take this opportunity as a moderator to ask a few questions before I open it up to the audience to ask a few questions. My question to Dr. Chandramouli particularly, I think you sort of highlighted the pros and cons of having the census not done and versus having the census, and kind of how delimitation interacts into that. I want to dig deeper into sort of your personal experience and talk about sort of what do you think were the obstacles that you face. We kind of touched a bit more on that, but with the upcoming census, what challenges do you foresee might be there with the delimitation and the census problem, as well as do you realistically think that sort of if we are able to start the census, will we be able to complete it in time for the next general election in 2029? So what are your views on that, sir?
See, the question of conducting a census is not a problem. It has been conducted over the last 140 years and will continue to. So the practical on it difficulties are not what I foresee as challenges. Probably technology will improve the collection process. It is the other debates around the census which will really play a role, which will try to vitiate the atmosphere in which the census is being conducted. Now, some of the issues which could prove contentious: one, the collection and creation of the National Population Register along with the census. Two, the debate around women's representation or the Women's Reservation Bill. Three, the caste census, which is being talked about of being conducted along with the main census. So many of these issues could have an impact on the integrity of the data collected, because these are divisive. I'm not saying that they are not necessary, they are divisive. And when there is a divisive atmosphere, there is a lot of tension in collecting that data and a lot of opportunities of vitiating the entire process by active campaigning or, mobilization along various lines, trying to boost your own numbers. So when it is conducted in a totally neutral atmosphere, people are generally apathetic to this whole exercise. But when it becomes a question of political survival or something of certain groups, there's an active mobilization around language, there's an active mobilization around caste, active mobilization around certain issues. So that has a potential to mar the integrity of the census. And that could have its, in turn, impact on the other processes downstream. So I think conducting the census as such, today the technology would really improve the quality, improve the time, cost, and other factors which I talked about. But basic issue is, will that data be free of questions? And how do you ensure impartiality in the entire process of this collection and actually collation?
Understood. So I think that tells us particularly about how that practically, while it might be feasible, there are a lot of other factors that we need to consider, such as reservation and kind of how we bring that along with the census and then use it for the delimitation process. So thank you so much for that, sir. Now moving on to Professor Aditi, I think sort of we are well aware of particularly the North versus South debate, or as you even mentioned, the Northeast and certain states which particularly are sort of in this process will be less represented. Could you, for the benefit of audience, kind of talk to us more about sort of constitutional principles particularly? We know that the one person, one value, one vote principle exists, right? But sort of are there any other constitution principles which kind of guide this? Would particularly say this North versus South debate, would that be rooted in any constitutional violations particularly? And sort of my question ties up to the larger idea of the crisis of representation at hand, right? All of us have talked about how sort of while this principle, which is extremely important, might be kind of violated, sort of my question particularly to you would be, what exactly is the crisis of representation which is being faced, right? So how will an entirely sort of population proportionate delimitation idea, right, sit aside alongside the scheme of the constitution? So kind of.
Right. So, well, speaking in terms of constitutional principles, yes, the Constitution does, even in the Constituent Assembly debates, the idea of one person, one vote is sort of recognized in that sense. And so is the understanding of a federal structure as far as, the Indian Constitution, the Indian Republic is concerned. But, well, itself in the constitution in any way connected to the Lok Sabha per se, which brings me to the other issue in this instance. You pointed out in your question that, if the delimitation process actually goes further after 2026 and does lead to, say, a certain sense of imbalance as far as northern and southern states are concerned, yes, essentially, southern states and states with a lower population would lose representation, would lose seats as far as Lok Sabha is concerned. But I think it points out to a larger issue at hand as well. The issue of what are the sites where the states can exercise power, right? Because currently our debate, again, I will go back to the idea of voting equality versus federal imbalance or political equality. This binary exists because Lok Sabha does feature as a primary site for exercising of power, of political agency, as far as, different representatives are concerned, legislatures are concerned. So I think in understanding how this federal balance can be preserved, and even when we go ahead with voting equality, even though we go ahead with delimitation, how can we tackle this particular problem that is being underlined needs to be done by looking even beyond the process of delimitation. We'll have to understand and reimagine the sites of of exercise of power as far as the states are concerned, whether it's within the Rajya Sabha or looking even beyond it with respect to electoral systems and what have you. Because in that instance, then you will not be sort of solely dependent on the structure in which has been given to the Lok Sabha for protecting states' rights. There will be plural sites of states to assert their positions, to assert their concerns, and maintain that federal balance, even while preserving the understanding of voting equality, no matter what equations or variables are brought about into the next exercise of delimitation.
Oh, thank you so much. That was really insightful. Over to you, Mayuri.
Can I just add to this? I think a very, very important question with Professor placed before you. Is this a matter of policy or is it a matter of law? So if you see the constitutional amendments, do they override the law? The law is clear that every 10 years there has to be a census. Based on the census, there has to be delimitation. But the parliament exercises its power to freeze the boundaries or freeze delimitation based on its wisdom of laying down policy. And Professor very rightly pointed out, courts have not grappled with this basic issue that can they interfere or can they make it a legal issue or not. This is a very important point I think all of you should bear in mind when we talk of this whole debate, whether it's a question of policy, can the courts intervene in a matter of policy, or it is the sovereign domain of the parliament.
So just to briefly add to that, this would also, like, if, Dr. Chandra here placed a really interesting question before you, and I'd like to just reframe it in terms of, again, the judicial interference or the matter being justiciable or not as far as the law is concerned. Here, again, while you are grappling with the issue of whether it's a policy matter or whether it's a legal matter, the question of rights and representation also will gain an important issue, right? That, as I said, like in the United States Supreme Court, they have recognized this particular right of voting equality under their Equal Protections Clause, which is every person would be equally protected under laws, which is the sort of an equivalent of our Article 14 of the Constitution. But that particular linkage has not really been visible in how this particular question is debated or raised before the courts as far as India is concerned. In fact, fun fact, the case which mentions and recognizes a voting equality under the Equal Protections Clause, which is Relens versus Sims, has been used by the Supreme Court to negate the same issue in one of its judgments, which really boggles your mind as far as legal precedent is concerned. So again, it's important how this particular issue is framed in the backdrop of what constitutes a policy or a political question, and how the courts and to what extent the courts would like to engage with this particular issue.
Engaging conversation. I'm sure the audience would also like to engage with the panelists and would like to ask the questions. We all come to questions from the audience. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much to the entire panel for this insightful discussion, and thank you to Dr. Chandra about some of the fascinating insights about the exercise. So I have a question regarding what Professor Aditi was saying about various sites at where these balancing exercises might be seen, or the states might reclaim their powers. Because I would like to ask you, because of late, because if you see the GST Council as an area, right, where states have been really struggling, and it has been very dominated by obviously the center and its allied regime. Similarly, when we look at the scope of 7th schedule, right, how concurrent list, particularly my area is criminal law. For instance, when we see the introduction of the 3 new laws, criminal laws, how much of an amendment or deviation from the existing statutes would be allowed to the new criminal laws? Because at the end of the day, it is a concurrent law subject. So in this balancing exercise, what all contours you could see? Would you see that our federal structure at itself could be upturned? Like in US, you have your different state Supreme Courts. They do not have something like 7th schedule like we do. They have very broad ranging powers given to the states themselves. So what do you really see very briefly could be some of these balancing exercises? Because my limited knowledge of GST Council shows that it just does not work so far, at least in that area. So any thoughts you might have, ma'am?
No, I agree with you. Actually, one of the main arguments which the proponents of federal imbalance arguments will bring about would be the idea of revenue, right? How revenue is shared between center and the state. And here again, I would like to point out that there is a systemic change that is required, right? That yes, we do need some policies in place, some institutions in place which would help in making this exercise of revenue sharing a non-partisan one. Even beyond GST, I would argue that of late in the recent years, the process has been becoming more partisan rather than less, where even the proceeds for welfare, programs and other revenues, grants that the state has to give to this, that the state receives from the center, have been divided, have been modified based on partisan lines. So I agree with you in that matter. But I think systemically we could look at, again, the way Rajya Sabha functions and the kind of powers that the state can be granted within its constitution. As Dr. Chandramouli pointed about the Senate experiment in the US, where each state could be granted an equal representation. I would argue that in that process, we would first require the reorganization of some states itself, so that roughly at least the population matches each other. And another experiment could be with respect to electoral systems, to bring about, considering the current political climate, because again, in any kind of electoral reforms, the party in power at that point of time would not like to, meddle with the variables which brought it to power. So I understand that the answers may not be that easy to bring about, but yes, I would say that, it being a systemic problem of how power is organized between different institutions would require a systemic response as well.
I would just like to add, having been part of the GST Council during the drafting stages of the GST and also the implementing stage, I was there. So there a new concept arose of a shared sovereignty, of a surrendered sovereignty, where the states actually surrendered their sovereignty to the center and center did vice versa. And together they came out with a consensus on the shape of the GST which is to come. So this is a new concept. It is something, it is not along strict political lines. Here, GST brought together the state and the center, and Mr. Jaitley, who was then the chairman of the GST Council, very nicely put it that this was a sharing of sovereignty, which was not a concept which was a legal concept, but it was basically a practical concept. They all agreed that, okay, the 7th schedule gives the state list, the center list, and the concurrent list, but they decided mutually to surrender their sovereignty to come out with a. So maybe that is the way for the future too. How do we use systems like the GST Council? Maybe that is a consensus building approach which could actually yield results instead of purely going on the juridical, the kind of legalistic approach that we usually adopt. So a more inclusive debate, a more inclusive kind of a solution finding exercise could be a solution.
Would be interesting also to note whether such excess experiments of consensus building and dialogue can actually be institutionalized so that they could be used by the states again to sort of exercise their, to bring about their specific narrative. Because in here as well, yes, it was an interesting experiment at that point of time, but the replication of that experiment in an institutional level is also important if we want to make it a part of the way decisions have been generally taken between the center and the state.
Hello. Yeah. Thanks a lot for all the speakers for being at this panel. And my question stems from this understanding that delimitation, while the discussion has been more about the seats and how seats will change, delimitation also involves the exercise of drawing the boundaries themselves. And now a recent exercise in delimitation was in Assam. And what has happened in the 2024 elections, for that matter of fact, is the BJP had less percentage and less number of votes than the Congress. The alliance itself, the NDA itself, got like 2% more vote share. However, the difference in seats is, I believe, 11:3. And the exercise itself has combined 4 seats approximately, 3 into 1 and 1 with another. 3 seats where Muslim population would have had significant advantage into 1 particular seat. And a parallel fact to this is that we have seen how agencies and institutions which were supposed to be independent are like losing their independence quite effectively in their act of losing their independence. And 329A of the Constitution prevents any court inquiry into this delimitation process. So what are your thoughts on this, and how do we go according, like how do we deal with this?
No, what you say is very correct. I mean, ultimately, delimitation will be a political exercise too. Right? I remember going to a prominent politician who had lost because of delimitation, because his old constituency had been completely changed and there was a new constituency, and the first question he says, "Tumhara census theek nahi hua." So basically now with this renewed kind of a focus on delimitation, there'll be a lot of pressures. In the Northeast, especially what you mentioned, in other states also, they have redefined boundaries in a way that a particular tribe becomes a dominant tribe over there and therefore can affect the electoral outcomes in that area. And this is deliberately done of changing the boundaries to either break the majority or create majorities. The hills versus the plains, and there are a lot of issues. If you go to the different states, there are different issues. Yes, it will be a political process, but the commission is set as such, is supposed to be an independent commission. They are supposed to bring out the principles on which they have done the delimitation. They do a lot of public consultation. So it is basically up to the awareness creation and the kind of stakeholders' participation in the process of delimitation. Most of them don't participate. They are agnostic to what's going on, and finally when the result comes out, suddenly they start running around, ye theek nahi hua, wo theek nahi hua. So basically, this will be the issue of the process of delimitation, how participative it is, how inclusive it is, how do they take the various stakeholders into confidence, how transparent it is. Maybe that then becomes justiciable. If you really have a clear set of parameters and those parameters have been violated, then it becomes a matter for the judicial system to really enter into this thing, right? So it is going to be a semi-political exercise. It will require a lot of public participation, stakeholder participation to ensure that it is done right.
And also like to add to that, so this is actually a very novel, distortion as far as delimitation is concerned in India, because this is basically gerrymandering, which is what is really gained its ground in the US, where you find constituency maps drawn to exclude a couple of houses in some instances, really taking pains to sort of construct an artificial majority. In fact, when we were researching on delimitation in itself, when we read about India and gerrymandering, the general position, academic position, was that because the sheer identities in India run so in such diverse directions, that a person in itself is embedded in such multiple identities, that it's going to be very difficult for anyone to predict their political positions and engage in a very efficient exercise of gerrymandering. But it poses another question, actually, that Dr. Chandra talked about these new additions to the census, which talks about the caste census, which talks about other divisive identities which need to be now created as a specific criteria in the census. Another question that can be engaged with is that whether that would make the exercise of gerrymandering also a bit easier on the political level as well, because you now have the data to predict political behaviors on multiple dimensions as far as constituents are concerned.
Actually, with artificial intelligence, now a number of scenarios. Earlier, the politician did not know what would be the impact. But today he can model, and there are agencies which will do this modeling for you, that if the boundary changes like this, what will be your prospects? If the boundary is like this, how it should be? And there'll be a lot of, focused pressure on the Delimitation Commission, because now there are tools which will allow you to do this very easily. And there are agencies which can be hired to do this also. You know how, political campaignings are going on. There are very specialized agencies who specialize in actually guiding political parties. Now they'll get into the whole debate now, and they will start creating pressure groups to put pressure on the Delimitation Commission. So this is also a factor, though the commission can also use the same tools, but there is going to be this additional pressure of a scientific approach to delimitation, which will be enabled by artificial intelligence.
Any other question, if you have? Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Chandramouli and Professor Aditi, for speaking an issue which doesn't form part of general public discourse. Already it is very important. My question is that I think both of you made this point that we need to look at the underlying assumptions of democracy and power and not see it as a binary. But I'm trying to just think that in how the constitutional understanding of democracy in nowadays seems to be very clear, there is a bundle of rights. It doesn't reside in any one part. It doesn't reside only in the constitution. It also resides in election commission order. It also resides in Representation of People's Act. It also resides in the power through which it also resides in election commission. It also resides in striking down legislation which gave us electoral bond, criminal antecedents. So in that, the only certainty with regard to protecting democracy over the last 10, 15 years has been that it can be secured or protected if there is political federalism. And in considering all of it, how is it knowing that if there is lopsided representation of states which already have fault lines on basis of linguistic identities, on basis of political identity, on basis of North versus South divide on basis of caste identities. How is it that it is not framed as a key question of democracy? Any kind of uniform protection or uniform law that makes individual as the basis in a state, knowing the theories of democracy that we have. Is there a possibility that it will be framed as a question of democracy?
See, basically, you have to look at the history too. Your states were not formed on the basis of population. Your states were formed on the basis of linguistics. And the constituencies are state-based. They don't go across state boundaries. These are fundamental questions. I mean, you're talking of one side, that equal representation, but the states itself have not been created on that basis. They have not been created on population. Otherwise, you wouldn't have had a large state like UP, which has a population more than, only 5 countries in the world have populations more than UP. When you start challenging the fundamentals, you'll find a lot of fault lines. Your 73rd and 74th Amendment gave powers to the local democracy. A kind of a, gray area where a lot of those financial powers and other powers have not really percolated down. So you can think of a lot of debates around, democracy, along of federalism, etc., etc. But do you really want to disrupt, or do you actually go along with a system that has worked so long and worked quite well, except for some faults which come up from time to time? So far, the system has not broken. And why meddle with something which is not broken? That is also something which you'll have to debate when you talk about all these. Whether fundamentally, if the distribution of powers to the federal parliament is only limited to 3 or 4 subjects like it is supposed to be, and states are the real this thing of all the other powers, and further down the states' powers are transferred down to the panchayat levels, then would this debate really take the same lines as it is being taken today? Now, these are all questions which we can keep on debating. So I think a lot of matter for the young participants to really talk about.
I think I'll add to what Dr. Chandra said. I think when you ask that the question whether it could be framed on the grounds of democracy, I think it's a very legal stance to take, but it would depend upon how you define democracy. Because right now, if we have to take it as a justiciable issue, the courts would be limited in their definitions as far as the constitution is concerned, because they cannot really redefine what a systemic, structure that has been defined in the constitution, right? They cannot really alter that until and unless there is an amendment or, say, a legislative action into that respect. So as far as the courts defining this question is concerned, yes, they can define it as a question of democracy. But the problem there is that either they can choose to sort of label democracy as essentially a political subject, which, I mean, it is kind of. And on the other hand, again, they would be limited in their action or in their, conceptualization of the question with the systems that we are currently bound by. So since this is a systemic discussion, a debate that we are engaging with, I think an action from the legislature, be it in terms of a constitutional amendment or a legislative exercise, would be essential. And the courts here cannot be looked upon as the sole, as the sole institution that could act in that respect.
Another fundamental question is it the will of the people or is it the will of the party? I mean, this is a fundamental question of democracy, right? Are we really representing? So you're saying population is being represented, but it is the party which is actually mobilizing on the basis of some ideology or some manifesto. So really, are we represented in the parliament by numbers, or are we represented by, the mobilization power of certain parties or ideologies?
I just want to ask one question, that when it comes to democracy, in a number of judgments, starting from ADR, if criminal antecedents had to be made public, the court did invoke democracy in a certain sense. If electoral bond was struck down, the court was working with an idea of democracy on one vote, one value. If election commission was backing of election commission was looked at and it was kept out of the control of the executive, the court was working with an idea of democracy. If in Representation of People's Act, if court said that electoral appeals on basis of caste, religion are not allowed, it was working with a secularized definition of public space of a democracy. If it has said that democracy is a basic feature, then lopsided federalism, where number of seats are reduced, it is a justiciable question. It's not a question in political theory of democracy. Courts have often framed it as this. So that is why I'm little surprised that how is it that representation on the basis of population seems to secure the value of one person, one vote. But I think it betrays a conscious understanding of a non-politicized public sphere in terms of court, to say that as if it is not able to see how these identities will play itself out. So yes, there can be disagreements, but I was just trying to think that there can be another way of looking at this.
Thank you so much for that comment. I think we'll have one last question. Particularly any participants would have sort of any question, any sort of, oh, yeah, we have Jay. Yeah. Yeah.
So my question to the panel was about the comparison of the comparisons to other countries that were drawn to the American Senate or to upper houses in Europe. Now, I think that comparison isn't that vitiated by the fundamental fact that other constitutions do recognize cardinal values other than equality, which our constitution in the political sphere doesn't. So, I mean, to put it simply, is it futile to expect any outcome other than just pulling the trigger and giving UP 140 seats or whatever the population would demand?
No, I agree with you, which is again, which brings back to the whole understanding of whether such values should be recognized or not, because that's basically what the central argument that we've been discussing here is, that the current systems with the current values that have been recognized in the Constitution don't seem to be serving our interests of diversity and plurality that well. And it makes sense. Historically speaking, there was justification for constructing the current system as it is, because it served the kind of contingencies that we were working with at that point of time. The main issue that we need to grapple with at this point of time is whether those contingencies have evolved into something completely different, whether we as a state, as a nation, whether we are ready to sort of, move beyond that initial system and look for a different experimentation as far as those systems are concerned, and whether as a legal regime, we are we are comfortable in recognizing diversity, plurality, federalism as something that can be protected by the court of law and by the constitutional system that exists here. So yes, I mean, generally, that's basically the problem in the nutshell, that the current systems and the current equation that we seem to be working with, even if it is given effect to, in a flawless fashion, may not actually bring about a result which everyone will be happy with. So whether we should change the equation in itself is what we need to be thinking about.
I would take you back to that map, the initial map. Now we are talking of diversity of extremes. Now, one state would represent several countries. So they can have their own system. So we will have to develop a unique system which is suitable for us. And that is where the native wit will come into, and that is where, the different ideas that Professor Aditi has been talking about. There are no binaries here. The hybrid system, which does not conform to your traditional notions of democracy and one person, one vote and things like that. It has to be a unique Indian solution to our unique problem, given our unique situation. So that is where our wisdom would come in. We have adopted various in our own constitution. It was adopting and adapting from various other constitutions of the world. We did not have, just one model to work with. So similarly, this would also require some kind of a wider canvas, drawing various experiences from across the world and then adapting it to our situation. And therefore, the balanced approach that we are talking about may not satisfy all, but largely if we can build a consensus around the solution, then I think we have succeeded.
I think, should we take one more question? Or do we have any? Okay, I think that's great. I think particularly sort of it's important to even understand that while delimitation happens for sort of the parliament and the seats thereof, I think we even had some inkling of that it happens for the state assemblies and the local self-governments. I think something to ponder about, but thank you so much for these intriguing questions. Over to you, Mayuri.
I'm sure we all have a lot of thoughts to consider and food for thought for ourselves. I would like to thank Dr. Chandra and Professor Aditi for making time for this meaningful conversation with us today on delimitation of electoral constituencies in India. Thank you to each one of us who has joined us this evening. Thank you and good night. Thank you.
Just once again, to conclude the session, we will like to our Honorable Registrar Ma'am to present the mementos to our esteemed panelist, Dr. Chandra, sir. To Professor Aditi. To Mayuri Gupta, ma'am. And to Anshu Dalmia, sir. Thank you, Vasanthi, ma'am. And thank you everyone for joining us for the panel discussion. everyone is informed that as per the schedule, the researcher test will happen at 7:30 p.m. Okay. The venue for the researcher tests are classroom number 1 and 2. They're at that site. Okay. 1 and 2.